December 20th, 1943, 27,000 feet above the German countryside. Second Lieutenant Charlie Brown gripped the controls of his crippled B-17 Flying Fortress as machine gun rounds tore through the cockpit around him. Half his crew lay wounded or dead. His bomber's tail section was shredded, engines smoking, hydraulics failing. Below him, a Messerschmitt 109 fighter closed for the kill, its pilot perfectly positioned for the final attack that would send Brown and his surviving crew to their deaths. But something unprecedented was about to happen in the skies over Germany. The enemy pilot, Oberleutnant Franz Stiegler, had Brown's bomber in his gun sights and his finger on the trigger. One burst from his cannons would finish the helpless American aircraft. Instead, Stiegler did something that would haunt both men for the next 50 years, and ultimately forge one of the most extraordinary friendships in military history. This is the story of how a moment of humanity in the midst of total war created a bond that transcended nationality, ideology, and decades of separation. But to understand why Franz Stiegler's decision was so remarkable, you must first understand what air combat looked like in 1943, when killing enemy air crews was not just expected, but essential for survival, and when showing mercy to the enemy could mean execution by your own side. The year 1943 marked the height of the strategic bombing campaign over Nazi Germany. Every day, hundreds of American bombers crossed the English Channel to strike industrial targets deep in German territory. Every day, German fighter pilots rose to meet them in aerial battles that claimed thousands of lives on both sides. The skies over Europe had become a killing field where survival depended on destroying the enemy before he destroyed you. For German fighter pilots, shooting down Allied bombers was not just military duty, but a matter of defending their homeland from destruction. British and American bombs were reducing German cities to rubble, killing civilians, and crippling war production. Every enemy bomber that reached its target meant more death and devastation for German families. Fighter pilots who failed to press their attacks were considered traitors to the fatherland. Franz Stiegler had already proven his commitment to that duty. By December 1943, he had shot down 22 Allied aircraft, making him one of Germany's most successful fighter aces. He had earned the Knight's Cross, Nazi Germany's highest military decoration, and was just 5 kills away from receiving the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, which would guarantee him a safe posting as a flight instructor away from combat. But Stiegler's path to becoming Germany's deadliest fighter pilots had not begun with dreams of military glory. Born August 21, 1915, in Regensburg, Bavaria, Franz Stiegler grew up in a family that valued honor, integrity, and compassion above military achievement. His father, Franz Sr., was a World War I veteran who had served as a pilot in the Imperial German Air Service. The elder Stiegler had witnessed the birth of aerial warfare during the Great War, when pilots on opposing sides still waved to each other before engaging in combat. He had flown reconnaissance missions over the Western Front and participated in some of the first air-to-air battles in human history. But the experience had left him with a deep understanding of war's human cost and a firm belief that honor must survive even in combat. Franz Sr. raised his son with strict moral principles that emphasized protecting the defenseless and treating enemies with dignity. He taught young Franz that true courage meant doing what was right, even when it was dangerous or unpopular. These lessons would prove crucial decades later when Franz faced the most important decision of his military career. Young Franz Stiegler showed early aptitude for aviation, spending countless hours building model airplanes and studying aeronautical engineering principles. He dreamed of becoming a commercial airline pilot, imagining a peaceful career flying passengers across Europe. When he completed his education in 1937, he joined Lufthansa, Germany's national airline, as a pilot trainee. But the outbreak of World War II in September 1939 ended Stiegler's civilian aviation career before it could begin. The German military conscripted experienced pilots for combat duty, and Stiegler found himself transferred from civilian flight training to the Luftwaffe fighter pilot program. Despite his personal preference for peaceful flying, He was determined to serve his country with distinction. Stigler completed fighter pilot training in 1940 and was assigned to Jagdgeschwader 27, a fighter wing equipped with Messerschmitt 109 aircraft. The Me-109 was Germany's premier single-seat fighter, capable of speeds exceeding 350 miles per hour, and armed with cannons and machine guns that could destroy enemy aircraft with short bursts. Initial combat operations over France and Britain tested Stigler's flying skills and marksmanship. He proved to be a natural pilot with exceptional situational awareness and precise gunnery. His first confirmed kill came during the Battle of Britain in 1940, when he shot down a Royal Air Force Spitfire over the English Channel. The victory brought him recognition from his squadron commanders but little personal satisfaction. Stigler discovered that destroying enemy aircraft meant killing young men much like himself. Each victory represented someone's son, brother, or father who would never return home. Unlike many of his fellow pilots who celebrated their kills with enthusiasm, Stigler approached aerial combat as a grim necessity rather than an adventure. He fought effectively but took no pleasure in the destruction. As the war progressed, Stigler's kill count steadily increased. He shot down Allied fighters over North Africa during 1942 and 1943, earning promotion to Oberleutnant and command of his own flight. His tactical skills and leadership abilities made him one of the most respected pilots in his unit. By late 1943, he was recognized as one of Germany's top fighter aces. But personal tragedy was reshaping Stigler's perspective on the war. His older brother August, also a Luftwaffe pilot, had been shot down and killed over Stalingrad in 1942. Several of Stigler's closest friends had died in aerial combat. The mounting casualties were taking a psychological toll on German fighter pilots who saw their comrades disappearing at an alarming rate. The strategic situation was also deteriorating for Germany by late 1943. Allied bombing raids were growing larger and more frequent. German fighter squadrons were being overwhelmed by sheer numbers of enemy aircraft. Pilots were flying multiple missions per day against impossible odds. Many were beginning to question whether Germany could win a war that seemed to be consuming an entire generation of young men. Meanwhile, 3,000 miles away in West Virginia, Second Lieutenant Charlie Brown was completing his own journey toward that fateful encounter over Germany. Born October 24, 1922, in Weston, West Virginia, Brown had grown up during the Great Depression in a working-class family that struggled to make ends meet during America's economic crisis. Brown's father worked in the coal mines of West Virginia, dangerous labor that provided barely enough income to support his family. Young Charlie learned the value of hard work and determination from watching his parents sacrifice to provide opportunities for their children. He excelled in school despite financial hardships and dreamed of building a better life through education and service. When the United States entered World War II following the attack on Pearl Harbor, Brown felt compelled to serve his country in its hour of need. He enlisted in the Army Air Forces in 1942 and requested assignment to flight training. Military aptitude tests revealed that Brown possessed the intelligence, coordination, and judgment needed for aircrew duty. Brown completed pilot training in 1943 and was assigned to fly B-17 Flying Fortress bombers. The B-17 was America's primary heavy bomber for daylight precision bombing missions over Europe. These massive four-engine aircraft could carry up to 4,000 pounds of bombs over long distances, but required crews of 10 men to operate effectively. Flying bombers over Nazi-occupied Europe was one of the most dangerous assignments in the American military. German fighter defenses and anti-aircraft artillery were destroying Allied bombers at an unsustainable rate. Aircrew casualties were so high that the Army Air Forces calculated that bomber crews had only a 25% chance of surviving their required 25-mission combat tour. Despite these sobering statistics, Brown was determined to contribute to the Allied victory. He was assigned to the 379th Bombardment Group based in England and began flying combat missions over German-occupied territory in late 1943. His first several missions involved targets in France and the Low Countries, where German defenses were relatively light. But by December 1943, Allied strategic planners were sending bomber formations deeper into Germany to strike aircraft factories, oil refineries, and other critical industrial targets. These missions required flying hundreds of miles through heavily defended airspace where German fighters could attack repeatedly before the bombers reached the safety of Allied territory. December 20th, 1943, began like any other mission day at Kimbolton Airfield in England. Brown and his crew received their briefing at 0400 hours and learned that their target was a Focke-Wulf aircraft factory in Bremen, Germany. The mission would require flying deep into German territory, where enemy fighter opposition was expected to be intense. Brown's B-17, nicknamed Ye Old Pub, was loaded with 4,000 pounds of high-explosive bombs and took off at 0630 hours as part of a formation of several hundred bombers. The flight across the North Sea and into German airspace proceeded normally until the formation reached the target area around noon. German fighters attacked as the bombers approached Bremen. Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190 aircraft dove through the bomber formation, their cannons and machine guns tearing into the flying fortresses. Several American bombers exploded or fell out of formation, trailing smoke and flame. The sky filled with tracer rounds, cannon shells, and falling debris. Brown's aircraft was hit multiple times during the initial fighter attacks. A cannon shell exploded in the nose section, wounding the bombardier and navigator. Machine gun rounds shredded the tail section and damaged the hydraulic systems. One engine began smoking and had to be shut down. Despite the damage, Brown managed to stay with the formation and complete the bomb run over the target. But the return journey would prove even more perilous. German fighters continued attacking the bomber formation as it withdrew from the target area. Anti-aircraft artillery filled the sky with exploding shells that could destroy a bomber with a single direct hit. Brown's aircraft sustained additional damage that killed the tail gunner and seriously wounded several other crew members. As the formation flew west toward Allied territory, Brown's bomber began falling behind due to engine damage and system failures. Damaged aircraft that could not keep up with the main formation became easy targets for German fighters looking for stragglers. Brown knew that his chances of survival were diminishing rapidly as his aircraft became isolated from the protective firepower of other bombers. At approximately 1400 hours, as Brown's crippled B-17 limped toward the German-Dutch border, a lone Messerschmitt 109 appeared off the bomber's starboard wing. The German fighter closed to within 200 yards, well within effective gunnery range. Brown could see the enemy pilot's face through the canopy and knew that his aircraft was about to be destroyed. The German pilot was Franz Stigler, returning from his own combat mission when he spotted the damaged American bomber struggling to stay airborne. Stigler had already scored 1 kill that day against a P-47 Thunderbolt fighter and was low on ammunition, but he had enough rounds remaining to finish the helpless B-17. According to Luftwaffe doctrine and his specific orders from Squadron Command, he should have attacked immediately. Stigler positioned his Messerschmitt for the perfect killing shot, lining up the bomber in his gun sight and preparing to fire the burst that would send it spiraling toward the earth. His finger moved to the trigger, as he had done dozens of times before in aerial combat. This should have been kill number 23 in his steadily mounting tally of enemy aircraft destroyed. But as Stigler maneuvered closer to the American bomber, he could see through the damaged aircraft's shattered windows into the interior, where wounded crewmen were tending to their injured comrades. The tail gunner was clearly dead, slumped over his twin 50-caliber machine guns with blood visible on the aircraft's aluminum skin. Other crew members were bandaging wounds and trying to stop bleeding. The B-17's nose section was partially destroyed, with gaping holes where cannon shells had exploded. The plexiglass bombardier's compartment was spider-webbed with cracks from machine gun hits. One engine was feathered and smoking while another ran roughly with visible oil leaks. The aircraft's tail surfaces were so badly damaged that Stigler wondered how the pilot was maintaining control. Most significantly, none of the bomber's defensive guns were tracking toward his fighter. The aircraft was completely helpless, unable to defend itself or pose any threat to German ground installations. Attacking it would be like shooting down a crippled bird that could barely fly. In that moment, Franz Stigler remembered his father's teachings about honor and protecting the defenseless. He recalled conversations with his mentor, Gustav Rodel, a World War I veteran who had impressed upon young pilots that their duty was to fight enemy aircraft, not to murder helpless airmen. Stigler realized that destroying the crippled bomber would be execution, not combat. Instead of attacking, Stigler did something unprecedented in aerial warfare. He pulled alongside the American bomber and began flying formation with it, positioning his fighter between the B-17 and potential threats from other German aircraft. He was deliberately protecting an enemy bomber from his own side's fighters. Charlie Brown, looking out from the pilot's seat of his damaged aircraft, could hardly believe what he was seeing. A German fighter was flying formation with him rather than attacking. The enemy pilot was close enough that Brown could see his face, and there was no hostility in the German's expression. Instead, Stigler appeared to be trying to communicate something to the American crew. Stigler stayed with the bomber for several minutes, flying protective formation as they approached the German-Dutch border. When they reached the edge of German-controlled airspace, Stigler performed a gentle rocking motion with his wings, the universal aviation signal for farewell, and peeled away toward his home base. He had escorted an enemy bomber to safety without firing a shot. Brown managed to nurse his damaged B-17 across the North Sea and crash-landed at an emergency airfield in England. Several of his crew members required immediate medical attention, but all the survivors would eventually recover from their wounds. Brown submitted his mission report to intelligence officers who were baffled by his account of the German pilot's behavior. Military censors classified Brown's report and ordered him not to discuss the incident with anyone outside official channels. The story of a German fighter pilot protecting an American bomber contradicted wartime propaganda about Nazi brutality and might undermine morale if it became widely known. Brown was instructed to forget about the encounter and focus on completing his combat tour. Meanwhile, Franz Stigler returned to his base at Höchstadt and faced the most difficult decision of his military career. His squadron commander, Major Rodel, asked about his mission results and whether he had engaged any Allied aircraft. Stigler could have easily claimed that he had expended his ammunition against other targets and found no opportunities for additional kills. Instead, Stigler told Rodel the truth about escorting the American bomber to safety. He explained his reasoning and accepted whatever consequences might result from his actions. Under Nazi military law, Stigler's behavior could be considered aiding the enemy, a crime punishable by court-martial and possible execution. But Major Rodel was a veteran pilot who understood the complexities of aerial combat and the importance of maintaining personal honor even in wartime. Rather than reporting Stigler's actions to higher authorities, Rodel quietly advised him never to speak about the incident again. The encounter would remain a secret between the two German officers for the duration of the war. Both men completed their military service without ever learning each other's names or identities. Brown finished his 25-mission combat tour and returned to the United States in 1944. He was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for his actions during the Bremen mission, but never spoke publicly about the German pilot who had saved his life. Stigler continued flying combat missions until the end of the war, eventually shooting down 28 Allied aircraft and earning Germany's highest military decorations. He survived the war and was captured by Allied forces in May 1945. After spending time in a prisoner of war camp, he was released and eventually immigrated to Canada, where he worked as a commercial pilot and flight instructor. For decades, both men carried the memory of their brief encounter over Germany. Brown often wondered about the identity of the German pilot who had shown such remarkable humanity in the midst of total war. Stigler occasionally thought about the American bomber crew he had helped escape and wondered whether they had survived the war. Neither man discussed the incident publicly, but both were profoundly affected by the experience. Brown went on to have a successful career in business and raised a family in the United States. Stigler built a new life in Canada, working in aviation, and eventually starting his own flight training business. They lived their separate lives on the same continent, never knowing how close they were to each other. The Cold War tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union dominated the post-war era, making wartime stories about cooperation between former enemies seem irrelevant to contemporary concerns. Both Brown and Stigler focused on their civilian careers and families rather than dwelling on their wartime experiences. But as the decades passed and the veterans of World War II aged, there was growing interest in preserving their stories for future generations. Military historians began collecting oral histories from combat veterans, and previously classified documents were being released to researchers. The heroic narrative of the Greatest Generation encouraged veterans to share experiences they had kept private for decades. In the early 1980s, Charlie Brown finally began talking about his wartime experiences with his family and friends. His children and grandchildren were fascinated by stories of aerial combat over Nazi Germany, but they were particularly intrigued by his account of the mysterious German pilot who had refused to shoot down his bomber. Brown's daughter, Susan, encouraged him to try to find the German pilot's identity. She argued that the story represented something important about human nature and deserved to be preserved for future generations. Brown was initially reluctant to pursue the matter, feeling that too much time had passed and that the German pilot might not even be alive after 4 decades. The process of searching for information proved frustrating at first. Military records from World War II were scattered across multiple archives in different countries. Many Luftwaffe personnel files had been destroyed during the war's final days, or lost in the chaos of Germany's defeat. Former German pilots were reluctant to discuss their wartime service due to lingering social stigma, but Brown persisted with help from military historians and aviation enthusiasts familiar with Luftwaffe operations over Germany during 1943. They helped him narrow down which German fighter units had been operating in the Bremen area on December 20th and which pilots would have been flying combat missions that day. But in 1986, more than 40 years after the encounter, Brown decided to write a letter to a newsletter published by the German Fighter Pilots Association. He described his experience on December 20th, 1943, and asked whether any members might know the identity of the pilot who had escorted his bomber to safety. The letter was published in the association's newsletter and distributed to hundreds of former Luftwaffe pilots throughout Europe and North America. Most readers were intrigued by the story, but had no information about the specific incident. Several pilots responded with their own stories of unusual encounters with Allied aircraft, but none matched Brown's description. Franz Stigler, living in British Columbia, Canada, received a copy of the newsletter several weeks after its publication. When he read Brown's letter, he immediately recognized the description of events from that December day over Germany. After 4 decades of silence, he finally had the opportunity to contact the American pilot whose life he had spared. Stigler wrote a detailed response to Brown, describing the encounter from his perspective and providing information that only the German pilot could have known. He recalled specific details about the damaged B-17's appearance, the number of crew members he had observed inside the aircraft, and the exact location where he had escorted the bomber to the edge of German airspace. When Brown received Stigler's letter, he was overwhelmed with emotion. After more than 40 years of wondering about the German pilot's identity, he finally had his answer. The man who had saved his life was not only alive but living just a few hundred miles away in Canada. Brown immediately wrote back, expressing his gratitude and requesting a meeting. The two men arranged to meet in person for the first time since their encounter over Germany. In 1990, Brown flew to British Columbia where Stigler was waiting at the airport. The reunion was emotional for both veterans, who embraced as old friends despite having been enemies during the war. Over the following days, Brown and Stigler shared their memories of the war and their lives in the decades since. They discovered that they had much in common beyond their shared experience in 1943. Both men had successful careers in aviation-related fields. Both had raised families and become grandfathers. Both had struggled with the moral complexities of their wartime service. Stigler explained to Brown the principles that had guided his decision not to attack the damaged bomber. He described his father's teachings about honor and his mentor's emphasis on fighting enemy aircraft rather than murdering helpless airmen. He revealed that he had never spoken about the incident until receiving Brown's letter in the newsletter. Brown shared his own perspective on the encounter, describing the fear and confusion he had felt when the German fighter appeared alongside his bomber. He explained how Stigler's actions had given his crew hope during their darkest moment and had ultimately saved their lives. He expressed gratitude that had grown stronger over the decades. The meeting began a close friendship that would last for the rest of both men's lives. Brown and Stigler began traveling together to air shows, military reunions, and schools where they shared their story with new audiences. They demonstrated that former enemies could become close friends and that humanity could survive even in the midst of total war. Their story attracted attention from military historians, documentary filmmakers, and authors who recognized its significance. The account of the German ace who refused to shoot a dying pilot and the American bomber crew he saved challenged simple narratives about good and evil in wartime. It illustrated the complexity of individual moral choices in extreme circumstances. Brown and Stigler collaborated on a book about their experiences, working with author Adam Makos to tell their complete story. A Higher Call, published in 2013, became a bestseller and introduced their remarkable friendship to millions of readers worldwide. The book emphasized themes of honor, compassion, and reconciliation that resonated with contemporary audiences. The two veterans also worked together to educate young people about the lessons of their experience. They visited schools and military academies where they emphasized that true courage sometimes means refusing to fight rather than engaging in combat. They argued that moral principles must guide military service and that enemies can become friends when wars end. Franz Stigler died in March 2008 at the age of 92 at his home in British Columbia. Charlie Brown died in November 2008 at the age of 87 in Florida. Both men lived long enough to see their story preserved for future generations and to understand the impact their friendship had on people around the world. Their legacy extends beyond the specific details of their wartime encounter. The friendship between Brown and Stigler demonstrates that individual choices matter even in the context of massive historical events. One pilot's decision to show mercy rather than follow orders had consequences that lasted for decades and touched thousands of lives. The story also illustrates the importance of moral courage in military service. Stigler's decision to protect an enemy bomber required him to risk his own career and potentially his life. His action was guided by principles taught by his father and mentor rather than by military regulations or political ideology. He chose to do what he believed was right, regardless of the potential consequences. Modern military training increasingly emphasizes the importance of ethical decision-making in combat situations. The rules of war require soldiers to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants and to avoid unnecessary suffering. Stigler's example shows how these principles can be applied even in the chaos and confusion of aerial combat. The friendship between former enemies also demonstrates the possibility of reconciliation after conflict. Brown and Stigler showed that people who fought against each other in war could overcome their differences and build meaningful relationships based on mutual respect and shared values. Their example inspired others to seek understanding rather than perpetuate hatred. Veterans organizations in multiple countries have used the Brown-Stigler story to promote programs that bring together former adversaries from various conflicts. Similar friendships have developed between veterans of different wars, showing that former enemies can overcome their differences and build meaningful relationships. The account of their friendship has been adapted for documentaries, stage productions, and educational materials used in schools worldwide. Military academies use their story to teach cadets about honor, integrity, and moral courage. The example continues to inspire new generations. Charlie Brown received his life-saving act of mercy on December 20, 1943, from a German pilot who chose compassion over duty. Franz Stiegler risked his career and possibly his life to protect an enemy bomber crew because his moral principles demanded that he protect the defenseless, rather than destroy the helpless. Their brief encounter over Germany lasted only minutes, but its impact endured for the rest of both men's lives. When they finally met as old men in 1990, they discovered that their shared experience had created a bond stronger than the national loyalties that had made them enemies during the war. Franz Stiegler demonstrated that individual conscience can triumph over military orders and political ideology. Charlie Brown showed that gratitude and forgiveness can overcome decades of separation and cultural differences. Together, they proved that humanity's best impulses can survive even in the darkest circumstances of total war. Their friendship stands as testament to the power of moral courage, the possibility of reconciliation, and the enduring strength of human connections that transcend the boundaries of nationality, ideology, and time. That's how one German pilot's moment of mercy created a friendship that lasted 50 years and inspired millions of people to believe in the possibility of peace between former enemies.